Hey everyone, this is Mrs. Urban, and I'd like to welcome you to a quick Chapter 5 review, and this chapter is entitled Research Problems, Purposes, and Hypotheses. The goal of this review is not to be comprehensive about Chapter 5, but rather to cover some selected topics that students typically run into trouble with. To get the most out of this review, you're going to want to have read the chapter and completed the reading worksheets prior to listening to the review. So if you've already done that, great. Grab those reading worksheets and have them in front of you. If you are not doing reading worksheets, that's certainly your choice, but at least have your book open in front of you so that you can kind of follow along with some of these topics. All right. So the things that I would like to talk about in this review are research problems and purposes, where we find them, what they are, and what are the differences between the two. Then we're going to talk about objectives, questions, and hypotheses. What are these guys and what are the differences between them anyway? And then we'll wrap up our conversation with a discussion about variables. Variables, 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 and more variables. So let's begin. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the idea of a research problem. Now, your textbook says that a research problem is an area of concern in which there is a gap in the knowledge needed for nursing practice. This is an important idea, this gap in the knowledge, because the reason why we do research is to fill these identified gaps in knowledge. Now, research geeks, like myself and other instructors who like research, we'll think of great ideas to do research for a variety of reasons. But in the end, we've got to figure out, too, that not enough research has been done on that subject. And so we'll go and we'll review the available literature that's out there, the research literature, looking to see how much work's been done on this subject. If it's been pretty extensively studied, then we need to find a unique angle or we need to find another topic to become interested in. The research problem typically indicates that significance of the problem. It provides a background for the problem, and it includes a problem statement. So the research problem is the gap in the knowledge that we're looking to fill with our project. Now, when you guys are critiquing your articles, you are going to be reading in the review of literature, which is in the front part of the research article that you've been assigned, and you are looking for the problem statement. The problem statement is going to identify that specific gap in the knowledge that's needed for practice. Most research articles will identify a gap in knowledge. Not all, but most. And usually they will say something like, little is known about fill in the blank topic, right? Or there is not much research done on the topic of fill in the blank. That's how you can identify the research problem statement. Okay, so that's a hint to you because all of you listening to this are probably looking in that review of literature for the research problem. Keep in mind, the problem is the gap that we want to fill with this research study. The research purpose, on the other hand, is quite different. It is why we are doing this study. It's why we want to do it. Why are we doing this thing anyway? So it's a clear, concise statement of the specific goal or focus of the study. So maybe we're identifying or describing, or maybe we're looking at relationships. Maybe we're doing an interventional study and we want to know how effective our intervention is, or maybe even we're describing outcomes in healthcare. That's often like a quality improvement type thing. The purpose statement often includes the variables that we are interested in studying. It'll include the population that we're studying, like adults or pediatrics, and it'll even identify the setting for the study. So a really great research purpose statement will grab all of that stuff in a single sentence. And a research purpose is used as a part of the blueprint that directs the rest of the study going forward. All right, so problem statements have a gap. That's the whole reason why we're doing this research. We can't just do it because it's cool, although I love doing research because it's cool. We really have to find a lack of evidence out there, and so that's why we need to do this study. And the purpose is exactly what are we going to do? What are we going to do in this study? Let's spell it out in black and white. Many times even the researcher will number it for us or bullet point it for us, like they'll even indent it for us. It's great. A hint for you is that purpose statements are often listed right there at the end of the review of literature, right before the section that says methods. And again, you know, as your instructor has probably already told you, we're going to focus mostly on the way we do things in quantitative studies, right? And not talk quite as much about qualitative studies. All right. So now let's move on and talk a little bit about objectives, questions, and hypotheses. They all sound like the same thing if you haven't done much reading. An objective, a question, and a hypothesis, you know, they're all ways of kind of saying, what's this study going to do? They actually all evolve from the problem and purpose statements and the literature review that you've done. The objective or question or hypothesis that is chosen by the author of your study will absolutely direct the remaining steps of the research problem. The thing is, you and I have to figure out where are they in this research article that we're reading, and how can we tell which one it is when we read it? Well, okay, let's read on and see if we can figure this out. First, let's start with a research objective. Another way to think of a research objective is to call it a research aim, or we could even call it a research sentence because it's going to end in a period. Your book calls it a declarative statement. That just means it says, here's what I'm going to do, period, right? It's expressed in the present tense, and usually we use them in descriptive or correlational studies. Stop. Did you feel like I just spoke another language there? Descriptive studies and correlational studies are all about research design, right? Now, you read a tiny smidge about research design in quantitative studies back in Chapter 2. So if you're feeling a little iffy about those words, look back in Chapter 2 where you read last week for a quick review of that. Also, you're going to get an in-depth review of all kinds of research design when you read Chapter 8. So, moving on. In your notes, for objectives, you could put in parentheses aims, and these are statements that end in periods that describe in the present tense what this study is going to do. And we use them in descriptive studies and correlational studies. Typically, they'll maybe focus on one or two variables, and they'll either talk about how we're going to describe them or what's the relationship between the two of them. All right, what's a research question? Well, a research question is a research question. It ends in a question mark. Your book calls it a clear, concise, interrogative statement that's again worded in the present tense. It includes one or more variables that we're interested in studying. What are we going to focus on with a research question? Well, again, we might choose to describe variables. We might look at relationships among variables, or we might even talk about things like independent and dependent variables or differences between two groups. In any one of these that I've just described for you, we might see questions. So these are the types of designs where questions can be found. Anytime a researcher decides to use questions, they're usually being a bit more narrow in their focus and being real clear about their study variables and their populations. All right, now let's talk for a moment about hypotheses. A hypothesis, or hypotheses if you have more than one, is a statement about the expected relationship between two or more variables in a particular population. And so really, whenever we start to use hypotheses, we're starting to do some prediction about what's going to happen. If A, then B. And so we're talking about the expected results or outcomes and of what we're hoping to find in our study. If we're talking about hypotheses, we are definitely talking about experimental and quasi-experimental studies, okay, and research designs. Now, some of you might be sitting back because you've done your reading, and you're thinking, hey, what's the difference between a purpose statement and objectives, questions, and hypotheses? I think that's a great question. A purpose statement that's been written by an author is going to be found in a paragraph, and it's really going to start with something like, the purpose of this study is to, or sometimes they'll write that in past tense, was to, and then you'll see what they wrote down as the purpose. But the objectives or questions or hypotheses will be listed separately. And again, you will definitely find those right before the methods section. Another question might be bubbling up to the top for you. That might be, hey, can a researcher use like objectives and questions and hypotheses and mismatch them all up together? Occasionally they do. And that's totally possible when they do that. So you need to read carefully when they list their specific objectives, questions, or hypotheses. Look for it if it's describing something, it ends in a period, or it's talking about relationships, you've probably got an objective or an aim. If it ends in a question mark, it's a question. Again, that one is probably, again, a descriptive or correlational study, but we'll have to look further at their design. And if you see a hypothesis, you better start reading for some independent and dependent variables. And you need to start thinking about experimental and quasi-experimental research design. Just like descriptive and correlational studies, you had a brief introduction to experimental and quasi-experimental designs in Chapter 2. If that's not feeling fresh for you, go back to Chapter 2 and get a quick read on that information, or save your questions for Chapter 8 where you're going to get the big picture. All right. As you read on in Chapter 5, you're going to see a couple of different kinds of hypotheses. Please don't freak out about all the different kinds of hypotheses. Just read those to have an understanding that hypotheses can be written in more than one way. Now, let's talk variables. Variables, variables, variables. Phew! Variables sometimes can be confusing, especially if it's been a while since you've studied this sort of thing. So let's dive in together and unpack this idea of a variable. So variables are qualities or properties or characteristics of, let's make it easy, people. Many times in nursing, we study people. And so it makes sense then that we might study the qualities of people, something about them, a property of people like weight or blood pressure or height, or characteristics of people. Now, you can also think about this, that we might also study the qualities, properties, or characteristics of things in science, and we might even study the qualities, properties, or characteristics of situations. Variables can change or vary. So variables are not something that stay the same. This should make sense to you. If you're going to study something about me and one of the pieces of data that you're collecting is my blood pressure is not the same from, hour to hour, right? Probably not even the same from minute to minute, depending on how you measure it. So variables are qualities or properties or characteristics of persons, things, or situations that can change or vary. Right about now, you ought to be thinking to yourself, hey, Mrs. Urban, that makes variables pretty gray. And you know, I like those things that are easily defined, that are clearly describable, that are like really black and white, right? So that there's no misunderstanding. And I would tell you, I agree with you, that if we're going to study something, which would be a variable, that we better define it really, really well. So the definitions of variables are important. More on that in a minute. There are many different types of variables in research. In our class, we're going to talk about 4 different types. We're going to talk about independent variables, dependent variables, research variables, and something else called extraneous variables. Now, I don't have extraneous variables up on the slide, but it's in your book, so we'll talk about it. So let's start here. Let's talk about independent and dependent variables. Now, I can't talk about what high school is like or middle school is like outside of the United States, but I can sure tell you what it's like inside the United States. With 3 children, I have had the pleasure of doing science projects in middle school and high school, at least twice in middle school and probably once or twice in high school. And each time we struggle with independent and dependent variables. They're taught each year what an independent variable is and a dependent variable is, and they do a project related to that. So I know if you have had education in this country, it's not your first rodeo. And if you're coming to school in this country from another country, you've probably been exposed to independent and dependent variables. So let's get these things defined. Independent variables are interventions. And these interventions are manipulated or varied by the researcher to create an effect on the dependent variable. So what are some other words for independent variable? Intervention, treatment, sometimes they'll call it the experimental variable. You know, different branches of science might call it something slightly different. The dependent variable is the outcome that the researcher wants to predict or explain. If we do our study just right with lots and lots of control, we're really hoping that we can say that changes in the independent variable can be seen and measured in the dependent variable. So I want you to just noodle on that for a moment. Independent variable changes are measured in the dependent variable. Okay, there's something else here called a research variable. Now, a research variable are the qualities, properties, or characteristics that are identified in a research purpose and in objectives or questions that are observed or measured in a study. Wait a minute. You know, that tells me pretty much that independent and dependent variables are going to be seen in a quasi-experimental and experimental study, and that research variables are going to be found in a descriptive and correlational study. Right about now, you're thinking, why does this lady keep talking about these different research designs? I'm trying to learn about variables. Well, the reason I do that is this. As you learn about research, certain words go with certain types of research designs. Don't just learn what these words mean and where we find them. Learn what designs they go with. So let's do it one more time. If your study, or better yet, your quiz question talks about independent and dependent variables, then your quiz question has to do with an experimental or quasi-experimental design. And we are curious about the effect of the independent variable, which we're manipulating, on the dependent variable. And then, if we want to think about this, research variables are qualities or properties or characteristics that are identified in our objectives or questions that we're interested in studying. So research variables we're going to see in objectives or aims, or we're going to see them in questions, which means we're going to see them in descriptive studies or correlational studies. Let that soak in a minute, because that's a really important connection that you need to make. All right. Last but not least, let's talk about a couple of extraneous variables. You know, extraneous variables exist in all studies, and they can kind of mess up your study. The reason why they can mess up your study is because they are things that happen during the study, and they can interfere with obtaining a clear understanding of either the relationships or the causal dynamics from the independent variable to the dependent variable. Sometimes we recognize these extraneous variables. Sometimes we don't see them until after the study is over. Those that we don't recognize until the study is in process, or those that we recognize but we know we can't control, they get a special name. They're called confounding variables. But if we can see them in advance and control them, that's something that we want to do in order to have the best study possible. There's another type of extraneous variable that we could think about. It's called an environmental variable. It's kind of a nod toward the idea that, you know, depending on the environment that you're in, it can impact your responses to being studied, right? For example, some settings we make very little attempt to control. Other settings we might want to make a big attempt to control that setting. So in descriptive and correlational study designs, or maybe I'm giving you a questionnaire or I'm interviewing, I might not do very much to control the setting that you're taking that questionnaire in. But in experimental and quasi-experimental designs, I might be trying to do a lot of different things to control that study to be successful. Let's talk for a moment about variables, and let's talk about the importance of defining them well. When we talk about variables, we really have to define them well, and we do it in two ways. We define them conceptually, and we define them operationally. What are those? Well, a conceptual definition gives the theoretical meaning of the variable, and it's often derived from the theorist's meaning of that concept. Wow, that was a lot of high-level language, right? Well, let's take those 50-cent words and turn them into 5-cent words. A conceptual definition is a definition of the variable that you are interested in using more everyday language. I'm not going to call it a dictionary definition. That's not quite right. But it's going to be a series of words or sentences to describe the variable you're interested in, so that when people read about this variable, they'll know what you mean. Like, oh, Mrs. Urban, that's too hard to understand. Give me an example. Okay, let me help you. Well, let's talk about the word stress. What does stress mean to you? Is stress when your parents get on to you? Is stress when you haven't cleaned your house in 2 weeks? Is stress a blood pressure of 180 over 120? Is stress a big GI illness? Stress can mean a whole lot of things to a whole lot of people. Is stress a newborn baby? Is stress 3 children? Is stress going to school and working full-time? What's stress? And so it's really important that we define that variable, stress, in order to study it accurately. The words that we use to define the word stress, that becomes our conceptual definition. That's the way we're going to define stress for our study. Since it's such a big concept, we need to define it more narrowly for ourselves in order to study it properly and so that our readers will know what we're meaning. We can also talk about operational definitions. So first, we're going to define stress usually by looking in the literature and seeing what how other researchers have defined it. When we define stress operationally, what we do is talk about how we're going to measure it. Guys, there's a bunch of different ways that we can be measuring stress. We can measure stress by giving people a questionnaire. We can check their blood pressure levels. We can draw blood and measure cortisol levels. We can sit them down and interview them and ask them about how stressed they are. There's a bunch of ways we can measure stress. But for our studies, we're going to have to pick one way or maybe two ways to do that. So if conceptual definitions are like words and synonyms that we have gotten from other research articles to describe the word stress, operational definitions are how we are going to measure it for our study. Maybe it's going to be a questionnaire and a blood test for cortisol levels. Like we get to pick, right, if we're the researchers. So it's important that our variables are clearly defined conceptually so that we can measure them well. Sweet. Look at what you learned. That's very cool. And so then last but not least, something that we want to talk about are demographic variables. Now, nursing students and real nurses, we understand demographic variables really well. Every time we do an admit to the hospital or the clinic, or we do a quick interview of our patient, we are typically asking about demographic variables. What gender are you? How old are you? What are your major health problems today? Do you work outside of the home? Are you married? All of those things are demographic variables. Those are probably the easiest of all these variables for people to understand. All right. Well, that is a quick rundown of Chapter 5. Again, this is not a substitute for reading. There's good information in Chapter 5, and you're going to want to take a look at that chapter so that you can be successful on your quiz and on your research article critique as well. If you have questions, you know who to email. And it's been my pleasure to chat with you guys today as a guest speaker. Good luck and happy studying.